A special documentary called The Narrow Bridge is screening on the 28th of May in Melbourne. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the director of The Narrow Bridge, Esther Takac. Esther, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Thank you, Peter. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here with you.
Nice to talk to you, and shalom. And and we should briefly mention that the film is about 4 people, 2 Israelis, 2 Palestinians in particular, who have gone through a grief process because of the tragedies that have impacted their families. And Esther has made a film about that and a bit more as well. So Esther, I'm really intrigued. You've been working on this film for quite a while. Tell me about the process, the origins, the idea, and the process of making the film.
Okay. Well, I've been working on the film since 2017, but in some ways, I've been working on the background of the film for longer than that. So I'm a child and adult psychologist in my day job. And I actually, I wanted to do some kind of community work with that. And I have a connection with Israel and the Palestinian territories. And so I decided to go and spend a month each year working as an honorary, i.e. voluntary psychologist in the pediatric department at Hadassah Hospital. And probably many people don't know that about 50% of the patient body at Hadassah Hospital come from the Palestinian sector. So I'm working with Palestinian and Israeli children and their families for about 12 years, going over once a year and doing that. And that's been fascinating work, and gives me a great excuse to spend time over there. And really in that work, I saw the effects of the ongoing conflict and how fear and hate can grow on both sides. But I've also seen what happens when an Israeli Jewish boy shares a room with a Palestinian Muslim boy, which is a daily occurrence, and how in that shared intimacy of sickness and vulnerability, people get to know each other simply as human beings and different relationships develop. And I saw that grief, like sickness, levels people in that same way. So in 2017, when I was working in the hospital, a friend of mine invited me to come with her to the joint Israeli-Palestinian memorial ceremony for victims of the conflict, which is something I'd heard about but had never been to. It happens on the same evening of Israel's Memorial Day, where there is a general big memorial for people who've died as a result of the conflict on the Israeli side. And this particular organization has put together this memorial that's bringing those who are mourning the loss of the victims on both sides of the conflict and saying, we need to stop this conflict. We need to stop there being more losses and more victims on either side. And it's a very brave thing that they're doing because they get a lot of pushback from both societies. So I went to that ceremony in 2017 and I was blown away by the power of it. I found it so emotional, so powerful. I really felt what they were doing is a model for people dealing with their trauma and their grief, and people working towards conflict resolution that is really important for Israel and the Palestinian territories, but is really a model for globally elsewhere as well. And so then I decided that I wanted to make a film about it because I really felt these people needed a bigger voice. But Peter, this is my first film. So I have been learning by doing. And I remember I rang my partner on the phone. He was in Australia, and I said, I'm thinking to do this film. And it wasn't a FaceTime call, it was just a phone call. I could kind of visually see him rolling his eyes like, what she's up to now. And in the beginning, I thought, I'll just be a 20-minute short film and we'll have to fund it because I didn't have any money. But as it evolved, because I wanted to follow the voices of a man and a woman from either side of the conflict, so that ends up being 4 people, you can't do 4 people's stories respectfully in a 20-minute film. So it has grown to be a feature-length film. And the filmmakers out there will know that you can't do a feature-length film on $20,000. So I had to find some money as well. So it's all been a very long journey.
Okay. So finding the money to be able to make the film and to travel and to take time to do the interviews, I mean, that in itself is quite a process, apart from being, as you say, a first-time filmmaker as well.
Yes, so that was all hard. It's a very low budget film. And I'm sorry to put off your budding filmmakers in the audience, but essentially there hasn't been budget really to pay for my work as yet, which I do have a day job, you know, I continue to have a private practice as a psychologist, so I could suck that up, but, you know, and because it was my first time, I had to manage with that. And the raising the money was hard. Film Victoria were wonderful and were supporters from the beginning. Andrew Weissman was the head of Film Victoria at the time, and he saw the potential in this film, and he gave me some development funding, a small amount, but it was the moral support that was important. Yeah. It was tougher getting some money out of Screen Australia, I have to say. So there were a number of applications that were rejected. And in the end, I did get some funding from Screen Australia through the Producer Equity Program, PEP, which I certainly recommend to all low-budget filmmakers out there. So that really helped. And then, shock horror on my part, I had to do a crowdfunding campaign because I've never done anything like that before. And Creative Partnerships Australia were wonderful with that. I did a workshop with them that kind of trained me up in crowdfunding. And they also had an amazing thing, which I hope is still going, where it was called the Match Workshop, where they would match $5,000 of your crowdfunding themselves. So I kind of hobbled together this budget, but it was always a small budget, and I always had to be very careful with how I spent the money. And so the cinematographers I used were not expensive. They were, you know, fresh out of cinematography school and not big fancy people. I used Palestinian and Israeli cinematographers, but they did a great job. Where I spent the money, and I recommend any other filmmakers doing this, was on the editing. I used really great editors, 2 really great editors, Uri Mizrahi and Rosie Jones. I worked very, very closely with them. I'd written a whole script of the film beforehand, and then I sat with them to do the editing. But I really acknowledge both of them for making the film look as beautiful as it does. And I think it does look beautiful.
Yes, absolutely agree with that. So you used a small crew, including cinematographer and yourself, and maybe a few other people, sound recordists as well, to record the interviews, or it was just basically you and one other person, or?
Yes, no sound recorders. They didn't have budget for a sound recorder. So it was the one cinematographer with his kind of boom mic there, right, and a lapel mic. And it was okay, I think, you know, yeah. And a lot of fix-ups can be done in the sound editing studio. So I feel bad because I love my filmmaking team here in Australia. So there were the 2 editors I mentioned, Uri Mizrahi and Rosie Jones. There was also my post-production person, Pete Pilley, who was fantastic, and my sound design person, Andrew McGrath. So they were all fantastic in making it look and sound as well as it does.
Okay, no, well done
but
on
there's
that.
There's a lot that can be done in post with not amazing. But yes. The sound was good enough.
Yes, no, it's fine. It's fine. Now, the 4 people who are central to your documentary, such interesting people. How did you find them, select them, and work with them?
Yes, I was very, very lucky, Peter, because I know that picking the right participants, the right subjects is really key. And often filmmakers will meet with a whole range of people and then choose the right ones. These were the only 4 I interviewed. So how lucky am I?
Mm.
The two men, Rami and Bassam, were kind of an obvious pick because they were the Israeli and Palestinian co-directors of the Israeli-Palestinian Bereaved Families Organization at the time when I started making the film. That's a rotating position. They're no longer the co-directors, but they were at that time. So they were kind of obvious, but they're great speakers. And what's amazing is that they become very close friends. They actually call each other brother. And I don't know if you realize that. Have you heard of the book A Paragon by Colin McCann?
No.
No. So A Paragon, Colin McCann is an international best-selling Irish writer who's based in New York. He wrote a book called Let the Great World Spin. That was very well known a few years ago. He came out with a novel called A Paragon. It came out in February 2020. So I was already well on my way of making the film. I was working on it from 2017. He came out with this book, A Paragon, which became best-selling as well, which follows the stories of Rami and Bassam. So I didn't know that at the time. Rami knew we were both working on these projects at the same time, but he didn't tell us about each other. I guess he thought, I don't really know where this is going to go. So, let's just let them both happen. And I was a bit shocked when the book came out. I thought, oh, no, this book's telling my story. But then I realized that it's actually really good for the film, for each other, because the book is a beautiful book. It's an amazingly written book. But people who've read the book will want to see the men in the film. So there is this kind of overlap or contiguity between the book and the film. And I'll tell you one other fascinating thing, which is that none other than Steven Spielberg bought the film rights to the book.
Ah.
So I am the little Australian low-budget documentary filmmaker who's made the film of what's going to be the big high-budget film that Steven Spielberg's working on at the moment. In fact, he's using Luke Davies to write the script, the one who wrote the script for Lion. Beautiful, that beautiful film.
Yep.
So that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
So I've kind of stumbled into this bigger world. So that's how I got onto Rami and Bassam. And then I spoke to people in the organization about the women. Meital was actually the first woman I interviewed. And I was in Tel Aviv at the time, and she was coming from where she lived in Jerusalem to Tel Aviv to have a haircut, as you do. And she came over, and that interview with her was just gold. I went back home and I showed my partner, who's also a psychologist, that interview, and it was so raw and emotional and powerful. I knew I had something there. So she was great. And then the Palestinian woman, Bushra, is in some ways the one who I've got the least direct contact to, because I speak a fluent Hebrew and a little bit of Arabic, but not a lot of Arabic. Bushra speaks Arabic, no English, and no Hebrew. So we need to have a translator there always. Also, Bushra lives in a village, Beit Umar, near Hebron, in the West Bank, where you're actually not allowed to go in. It's not easy to get in there. There's the checkpoints. You can't really go. You're not allowed to rent an Israeli car and go in. So that was all a bit more complicated. But Bushra is amazing. I love Bushra. Bushra has got the biggest, in a way, character arc of them all. She was a young village woman who married at 14 and hardly left her village. And then when her son, Mahmoud, was killed, after she went into this deep depression, really, for up to about 5 years, she told me. But since then, she has now become this international speaker. She flies around the world speaking about reconciliation. So it's pretty amazing.
What an interesting story about these four people and how you got to film them and so on. And how interesting! And Spielberg picking up the rights to the novel. That's fantastic. Yeah.
It is interesting. Yeah,
that's
I mean,
great.
who knows? I don't know with the Spielberg film. Maybe it won't come out in the end, but I know it is in development, and he has a point. Luke Davies is working on it. So
Yeah. Okay, no, that's great. In the filming of these four people who are really so interesting, and their stories are, pretty awful in some respects, but also quite evolving in terms of them moving forward and wanting peace and so on to stop all this bloodshed. Did you find that there were occasions when they had difficulty with some of the filming, or wanted you to stop or to not use particular bits?
That's an interesting question. Thank you. There were difficulties, not what you're thinking, actually. I think not what you think, not what I think you're thinking. So I'll tell you one angle. So being a psychologist and a filmmaker sounds like a good idea, but actually it's kind of quite complicated, because sometimes you feel those roles are in conflict. As a psychologist, my role is to kind of look after people emotionally. As a filmmaker, it can be to push them to tell their stories in the way that's the best way for the audience. I was really clear I didn't want to exploit. So I just want to, for your viewers, just be a bit clearer that Rami's 14-year-old daughter was blown up in a suicide bombing attack. Bassam's 10-year-old daughter was killed by a rubber bullet shot by an Israeli soldier. It was kind of an accident. Bushra's 17-year-old son was killed in the village when he was kind of protesting, but not violently. And Meital's father was axed to death by 2 Palestinian youths in his garden. So they're really horrific stories, very traumatic.
Yeah.
It was really important for me in my interviews not to sensationalize, not to exploit, and not to re-traumatize them. So that was one side. For people who do see the film, they'll see that Rami talks about being a soldier in the Yom Kippur War, the 1970 war, and how he still has nightmares from that and wakes up sweating from that. I'm sitting there as a psychologist, and I know he's got post-traumatic stress disorder. That is the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah. And so we did stop the camera rolling for a little bit to talk about that. I felt like as a psychologist, I couldn't respond to that. So, that was important to kind of stop and have a chance to talk about it. So that's one example of the complexity. But the other thing was, I went to film at the time of this memorial ceremony because I wanted to capture some of that. That's in May. It happens to overlap with the same time as Ramadan. Ramadan is a month where Muslim people fast during the day and only eat after nightfall. So I was having Bassam and Bushra come for interviews during the day when they were fasting. So that was tricky. There were other things like, I had to go and pick up Bassam from a checkpoint somewhere. And with my cinematographer, we're driving around. For the life of us, we could not find this checkpoint. It was not on any map. It was not on any Google map. We're driving around through the West Bank. It's a little bit scary. And we didn't find him, We ended up having to meet him somewhere else. So those were the sorts of difficulties. But amazingly, there wasn't anything they said in the interviews that I wasn't comfortable with, and there wasn't anything that I asked that they were uncomfortable with it. I worked really hard to make the film balanced and nuanced, and I know it's been shown to Palestinians. I mean, both Bushra and Bassam saw it obviously before it went public, and they were happy with it. But it's been shown to Palestinians and Israelis, and they're comfortable with it, which is really important.
I was going to ask you about that. That's really good to hear. What a process. And yes, I understand that balancing act that you have to undertake in terms of the filmmaking process. Yeah, no, really interesting. And I noticed the film also goes into the Women in the World Summit and the role of women in, I suppose, ensuring that some sort of peace can occur.
Yes. So one of the wonderful scenes in the film is filmed at Bushra's home in Beit Umar, where we have Israeli and Palestinian women coming together to hear Meital and Bushra share their story of loss, but really as a group of women to think about how they can be involved in as working towards conflict resolution, as fighting for peace. And there's this real sense of womanhood, able to have this conversation amongst women. And Maytal says in the film that the leaders on both sides are men. There's Bibi Netanyahu, who was the leader then, and I have to say, unfortunately, is the leader again in Israel, and Mahmoud Abbas, who is the leader. And she says, and these men, they treat us like pawns on a chessboard, you know, they're kind of moving around. And it's the women who often are the mothers of these children who are killed, and we need to be able to speak to each other, women, to change this. So there is this kind of movement of the moment of women's strength in the film that I think is really important. And those women, Israeli-Palestinian women's groups are a really important thing. There's also something in Israel called Israel and the Palestinian territories called Women in Black, who have been standing at occupation checkpoints for decades now, protesting against the occupation. There's a women wage peace organization that's very big. So there is quite a big grassroots movement of Israeli and Palestinian women working together.
That sounds good. Let's hope that some sort of peace and negotiations can occur, and that the hot-headed men who run Israel and Palestine can see sense. But I know how.
Yes.
I mean, this has been hundreds, thousands of years of conflict, really. So it's amazing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Probably not thousands, but still.
Yeah, of course. Now, I noticed the film also played at the, apart from GIF last year, at the Spokane Film Festival in the US. Tell me about the reaction there.
Oh, well, Spokane, I mean, it's played at a lot of places in the US, New York, Toronto, Boston, Toronto, Canada, Boston, San Francisco won the Audience Award. Spokane, well, I'd never heard of Spokane. Spokane is a little, do you know Spokane?
No.
Spokane is a little town up in the north somewhere that found about the film, and it actually won the Audience Award at Spokane. They really loved it. And I did a Q&A there that's actually up on the film's website. I was interviewed from somebody from, I forget the name of the Alliance for Arts and Media, that did a great interview. So yeah, it went well at Spokane.
It's great to have your film travel around and for people to see it, because it's so important that a documentary like this is seen as widely as possible in order to assist the political process, I suppose, of trying to have peace.
Yes, I guess it was always envisioned as what's called an impact documentary, you know, that it has, and I do have a program associated with it about using the film as a tool for conflict resolution, and also as a tool for organizations working with people with trauma. That's something we haven't spoken about, but it really shows these 4 people moving through their trauma to develop strengths that they didn't have before, in a process that psychologists now know about and call post-traumatic growth. So I think it's interesting on that side as well.
It certainly is. Film as healing. I like that. That's that's very good.
Yes.
Okay, and you mentioned the editing process. And you had 2 really good people involved in the editing, but it must have been quite difficult at times to decide what remains in the final edit and what has to not be in the final edit, and that in itself is always for documentary filmmakers a difficult process.
Yes, well, there's a whole, of course it's very difficult. There's a whole thread that was potentially in the film that I took out. So underlying the work of these people, of this Israeli-Palestinian Bereaved Families Organization, it's an example of what's called people-to-people peace building, which is a bottom-up grassroots approach to peace building. What often happens is what's called a top-down political process. That's what was tried in the Oslo Accords for Israel and Palestine, and it failed because the societies on the ground weren't ready for it. You need to have, and this was shown in Northern Ireland and South Africa, you need to have this bottom-up changes where you're actually changing the cultural conflict from the ground up. And sorry, I've forgotten. What was the question? I've forgotten my thread.
Oh, it's about the editing process and what stays and what goes.
Oh, that's right. Thank you. Sorry. And so that whole thread of transitional justice is really interesting in the film. And I interviewed a Palestinian professor, Professor Mohammed Dajani, who heads up an institute called the Wasatiyah Institute for Moderate Islam, who speaks about that transitional justice process from the Palestinian side, and a Dr. Jeremy Bracker, who was at the Minerva Center for Human Rights at Hebrew University, who speaks about that from the Israeli perspective. So I had that more political thread in the film explaining that process, and we decided to take it out. So that's one of the things that ended up on the cutting floor.
Right,
we decided just to go, it felt a little bit didactic, and we decided just to go that the 4 stories were so powerful that was enough.
Okay, I can certainly understand that, but there may be a possibility of a DVD release or Blu-ray or whatever where you can incorporate some of that footage.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, good one. Now, tell me about the screening that's happening in Melbourne on the 28th of May.
So what's amazing is an organisation called +61J Media, who were one of the partners of the film. They're an Australian-based organisation. They, were very generous and gave some money to the film. So they learned about Rami and Bassam and this organisation through the film, and were really so moved by them that they have brought Rami and Bassam out on a high-profile speaking tour to Australia now to promote the concept of people-to-people peace building. So they're speaking at the Wheeler Centre in Melbourne on Monday, the 29th of May. It's sold out. They're speaking this coming Sunday at Sydney at the Ara Theatre. They're speaking in Canberra to politicians. And as part of that, my film screened last night in Sydney with a Q&A with Rami and Bassam and myself. And then there's a Q&A in Melbourne on Sunday, the 28th of May at 4 p.m. at the Classic with Rami and Bassam and myself. Yes. So it's great to have them here and hear directly from them as well.
How very,
they were
interesting.
actually on the religion and ethics, Radio National Religion and Ethics show yesterday.
Okay. No, that's really great to tie their visit and the film in together and so on. That works really well. Well, look, congratulations on the film, Esther. And I just wanted to ask you now, are you going to make another film, a follow-up film, or something else?
Well, I'm actually working on a short film at the moment for the State Library of Victoria, but I won't go into that so much. I've discovered that I do love film and making film. It's such an exciting, creative process, and I love the collaborative teamwork, working with the editors and the other film people. So I would love to do something else. Unfortunately for me, I'm a bit of a genre crosser. So, I've written some books in different genres. Anyway, so before this documentary started, I've got a feature film script in the drawer, and I would love to do that. But that's a whole other genre. It's not documentary, it's feature film. So I don't know how I'll go with that. But I have got other ideas bubbling away for documentaries, but kind of too early to say.
Excellent. Hopefully they'll reach fruition and that you're able to make them. That sounds great. And I will ask the last question I'll ask all filmmakers. Have you seen anything of late, cinema, television, streaming, anything
Yes.
that impressed you?
I just saw Still, the feature film about Michael J. Fox having Parkinson's. So Michael J. Fox was diagnosed with Parkinson's at the age of 29. And there's a feature film about him. I can't remember who directed it. That's my bad. And so it's not a it's documentary. It's a documentary, but it feels like a feature film. It's on Netflix, I think, and it's a beautifully made film.
Okay. I've heard a
That's
bit
just a
about
recent
it.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. How interesting. And I certainly urge all people to go on the 28th of May to the Classic to see The Narrow Bridge. And it's been my great pleasure to be speaking to the director of The Narrow Bridge, Esther Takac. Esther, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you, Peter. It's really been a pleasure.
Shalom.
Shalom.